After 24 hours on shift, a coffee stain on her scrubs and eyes heavy with exhaustion, she climbed into the wrong car. He looked at her like she'd dirtied the air he was breathing. Back in room 407, her mother was gripping her hand like someone holding on to their own life. "Get out of my car. Now." The voice sliced through the air like a blade. Claire Bennett's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding, and for one disoriented second, she had no idea where she was. What had happened? Because there was a man in a dark suit sitting beside her, staring at her like she'd committed a crime. The car was idling at the exit of Lakeside Memorial Hospital, just off Michigan Avenue in downtown Chicago. The engine was running the air conditioning ice cold, and that man, Daniel Hartwell, 38 years old, jaw tight, brown eyes carrying a coldness she had never seen on another human face, had his arm extended toward the door like he was dismissing something that had no business being there. Claire blinked once, twice. The stethoscope still hung around her neck, her backpack sat in her lap, and the coffee stain on her green scrubs was still there. She hadn't even had time to change between shifts. 24 hours inside that hospital. 24 hours of pressure of hallways, of split-second decisions, of holding the hand of someone afraid they wouldn't wake up the next morning. And now she was here in the wrong car with a man looking at her like she was invisible. The bad kind of invisible. The kind that gets in the way, that takes up space it isn't owed, that needs to be removed before it causes more damage. She started, her voice rough with fatigue. "I thought this was my rideshare. I'm sorry, You broke into a private vehicle." Daniel didn't lower his tone. There was no explosive anger in it. There was something worse. Contempt. Controlled. Measured. Served ice cold. "I don't know how you confused a private car for a rideshare, but that's not my problem. My problem is that I need to leave right now, and you're sitting in my seat." Outside the hospital's doorman, a man in his 50s named Frank, who knew Claire by name, who knew she took her coffee black, who always asked about her daughter when their paths crossed in the lobby, stopped in his tracks. Not because he wanted to, because Daniel's voice carried the kind of authority that makes people freeze without meaning to. A rideshare waiting in line honked once, then twice. Michigan Avenue traffic had no patience for ceremony. Claire felt heat rise in her face. It wasn't shame. It was something older, something deeper, that feeling of being seen as less, of having her exhaustion dismissed, of having 24 hours of caring for other people treated as irrelevant next to 2 minutes of inconvenience for a man who had probably never spent a full night on his feet looking after anyone but himself. She took a breath, picked up her backpack, settled the strap on her shoulder, and before opening the door looked at him. Not with anger, not with tears, with that clear, direct look that only people who've learned to stand upright under real weight can hold. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice low and steady. "I'm not going to apologize for being tired." And she got out. The door clicked shut. It didn't slam. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse than that. It was dignified. And dignity in that moment weighed more than any comeback she could have thrown at him. Frank was still watching. As Claire passed him on her way to the sidewalk, he opened his mouth like he might say something. She gave a small shake of her head. Not now. And she kept walking, footsteps steady against the warm Chicago concrete, the city loud and indifferent around her, the way it always had been. The way it always would be. Inside the car, Daniel slapped his palm against the back of the front seat. "Go, Marcus!" The driver, Marcus, 45, discreet the way any good professional learns to be during his boss's conversations, pulled away without a word. But his eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror for a single second. Not out of carelessness, out of involuntary humanity. Daniel either didn't notice or didn't want to. He was staring at his phone. 4 missed calls from a contact saved as St. Benedict's Care Facility Private Line. His stomach twisted in a way that had nothing to do with what had just happened 30 seconds earlier, and everything to do with what had happened 3 days before that, when the doctors had pulled him into a small, quiet room and used words he still hadn't managed to organize inside his own head. His mother, Eleanor Hartwell, 67 years old, had been admitted 11 days ago, and she was getting worse. Claire found her actual ride share 2 blocks up. She got in, dropped her backpack on the seat, leaned her head against the cold glass, and closed her eyes. She didn't cry. That was the detail nobody understood about her. Claire Bennett, 34, an ICU nurse with 8 years under her belt, didn't cry in front of people, not because she didn't feel things, but because she'd learned in her very first year on the job that some kinds of pain need a private room to exist in. And a hospital hallway, the backseat of a car, or a crowded downtown sidewalk were not that room. What she felt while Chicago slid past the window in streaks of light and shadow and horns was a mixture she knew well: injustice and exhaustion. Old companions, both of them. She had walked into this profession knowing she'd be invisible most of the time, that people would call for her when they needed her and look straight through her the moment they didn't. She'd learned to find the value of her work not in outside recognition, but in the small, real moments: a patient's hand tightening around hers in the middle of the night, the smile of someone who'd arrived afraid and was leaving with hope. At Lakeside Memorial, she'd come on 3 weeks ago to cover an opening on the private wing of the 4th floor, and in 3 weeks, she'd grown especially close to a patient in room 407, Eleanor. A white-haired woman with lively eyes and a way of smiling that made the room feel a little bigger. A woman who asked everyone's name and remembered it, who, even on the hardest days, always had a kind word to offer. Claire didn't know, sitting in that ride share, trying not to think about the man in the car, that Eleanor had a son. She didn't know his name, didn't know what he looked like. She only knew that Eleanor waited for him every single day, and that every single day he showed up late and left early, and Eleanor never complained. She just looked at the door with the smile of someone who'd learned to turn absence into a kind of patient waiting. "He carries a lot," Eleanor had told her once while Claire adjusted the IV stand. "Always has. He's carried everything alone since he was little. But his heart is good, sweetheart. It's just buried under a lot of heavy things." Claire had smiled, had thought every mother says that, had thought it's not my place to judge, and had gone on with her work the way she always did, with care, with presence, with that quiet attentiveness that makes a difference even when nobody's watching. That night, Claire got home to her apartment in Bridgeport, showered, heated up leftover soup, and sat at her kitchen table with her clean scrubs folded on the chair beside her, ready for tomorrow's shift. Because she'd learned a long time ago that real rest starts the moment you stop putting everything off. She looked at the scrubs for a while, thought about the man in the car, the cold voice, the arm pointing toward the door like she was an object misplaced, like 24 hours of caring for other people's lives could be erased by 2 minutes of inconvenience for someone who'd never once had to be invisible just to survive. She blew on her soup and decided right then exactly what anyone with dignity would decide. Let it go, move on. Tomorrow was another shift, other patients who needed all of her, not a version of her, fractured by the memory of an arrogant stranger in an expensive car. What she didn't know, what fate had already decided, with the quiet cruelty only real life seems capable of, was that letting it go was never going to be an option. Because the next morning when she pushed open the door to room 407, chart in hand, and a smile already forming for Eleanor, there was a man standing by the window with his back to her. Dark suit, shoulders tense, like someone carrying the whole world without asking for help. And when he turned, when those cold brown eyes met hers, the recognition was instant, brutal, and completely inescapable. It was him, the man from the car. And for the first time since the night before Daniel Hartwell's face lost for a fraction of a second every piece of its armor, the silence lasted less than 3 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that doesn't disappear afterward. The kind that lodges itself in the body, in the tension of the shoulders, in the way the air stops moving properly between two people who recognize each other at the worst possible moment. Claire didn't step back, didn't let her hand shake around the chart, didn't let her face give away anything beyond what was safe to give. Professionalism, presence. The same clean, direct look she'd held on the sidewalk off Michigan Avenue the night before, when he'd pointed at his own car door like he was tossing out something worthless. Daniel stood frozen by the window. Morning light came through the blinds in parallel bars, cutting the room into stripes of brightness and shadow. He was in a suit again, charcoal gray this time, white shirt, no tie, like he'd come straight from somewhere that demanded formality, but hadn't left him time to finish getting ready. His eyes found hers, and for that fraction of a second she'd caught at the door, there was something in them that wasn't coldness. It was shock. Then the shock left and the coldness came back. "You're a nurse here?" It wasn't a question. "I am," Claire answered with the same economy of words. She turned toward Eleanor, who was sitting up in bed, eyes open, smile already forming, claiming the room the way a third character claims a scene. "Morning, Eleanor. How was the night?" "Better," Eleanor said, and her voice had that soft, unhurried texture of someone waking slowly, carefully, like the day itself might be fragile and needed to be handled that way. "You were in my dream, telling me a story. I don't remember which one, but it was good." Claire smiled, a real smile, because it was impossible not to smile for real around Eleanor. "Then it was a good dream," she said, and began checking vitals with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who'd done this for years, who'd learned that the speed of your hands feeds a patient's anxiety, one way or the other. Daniel watched motionless, a man used to controlling every room he stood in, realizing in real time that he controlled nothing here. "Daniel," Eleanor said, turning her head toward her son. "You know Claire. She's the best nurse on this floor. Ask anybody." "We've crossed paths," he said. His voice came out neutral, managed. Claire didn't look up from the chart. "Crossed paths where?" Eleanor asked, with the genuine curiosity of someone who still believes coincidences are gifts. Claire answered before he had to. Simple, true, without any of the details that would have hurt, without any of the omissions that would have lied. It was quick. It had been quick. Painful, but quick. Eleanor accepted that like it made perfect sense, and turned back to her son with that patient, unshakable love that only mothers who've already forgiven a great deal can sustain. "She's got healing hands, that one. Seriously. When she holds my hand, I calm right down." "You believe that?" Daniel didn't answer, but his eyes went to Claire's hands, steady, unhesitating, writing something in the chart, and lingered there a second longer than they should have. He left the room 20 minutes later when the attending physician arrived for his morning rounds. Claire stayed as protocol required to follow the visit, note the instructions, and make sure Eleanor understood everything without getting rattled by medical jargon the doctors sometimes forgot to translate. Dr. Robert Ellis, 52 head of the private wing, a man of blunt speech and economical gestures, examined the patient carefully, asked his usual questions, and then asked to speak with the responsible family member out in the hallway. Claire stayed behind with Eleanor. The older woman waited for the door to close, then looked at her with eyes that saw too much. "He was hard on you, wasn't he?" Claire looked up, met her gaze. "Eleanor, I know my son." She said it without accusation, without drama, with that gentle sadness of someone who accepted a hard truth a long time ago. "When he's scared, he hardens, always has, since he was 8 when his father walked out, and he decided he was never going to let anything get that close again." Claire stayed quiet. "He's not a bad man," Eleanor went on. "He's a man who learned to use hardness as armor. And armor, honey, it doesn't just protect you from the outside, it protects you from the inside too. And that's how a person ends up trapped." Claire looked at that woman, 67 years old, white hair, hands marked by time, eyes that still held a startling clarity, and felt something she couldn't name in that moment. It wasn't pity. It wasn't forgiveness. It was closer to understanding, the kind that doesn't change what happened, but opens up a single millimeter of space, so the story doesn't freeze at one point forever. "The doctor said something important out there," Claire said, gently changing the subject because that's what the moment called for. "I need you resting more this afternoon. No long visits, nothing that gets you worked up." Eleanor nodded but caught Claire's hand before she could step away. "Are you going to keep taking care of me?" The question was simple, its weight was not. "I am," Claire said. And it was true, because whatever had happened in that car was between her and Daniel. Eleanor hadn't done anything wrong. Eleanor was a patient, and Claire had chosen this profession precisely because she knew how to separate what hurts from what needs to be done. Out in the hallway, Daniel listened to Dr. Ellis with his chin slightly raised, arms crossed, the posture of a man trying to look composed while the floor disappeared beneath him. The doctor's words were measured, clinical, but the meaning underneath was clear. Eleanor's condition had grown more complicated over the last 48 hours. Her body was responding slower than expected. They needed to adjust the treatment. They needed more time. Above all, they needed her to stay calm because emotional strain was directly affecting how her case was progressing. "She has a nurse doing extraordinary work with her," Dr. Ellis said, checking the chart. "Claire, your mother responds differently when she's around. Heart rate more stable, fewer nighttime anxiety episodes. That has real clinical value, it's not just an impression." Daniel stayed quiet. "I'd strongly recommend continuity of care be maintained," the doctor continued. "Switching her team right now would be an unnecessary risk." "Understood," Daniel said. His voice came out whole. Something inside him did not. The doctor moved on, and Daniel stood alone in the fourth-floor hallway of Lakeside Memorial, the soft, constant noise of the place all around him, footsteps, carts, low voices, that particular sound of a place where life and fear share the same square footage. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do with his own hands. He looked at the closed door of room 407. On the other side, he knew Claire Bennett was taking care of his mother with the hands Eleanor had described, with the kind of presence the doctor had just wrapped in cold, clinical language, but which translated meant something very simple. She mattered to his mother's recovery in a way that he, with all his money and all his power, could not replicate. And he had told her to get out of his car like she was nobody. The realization didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It came slowly, in the most uncomfortable way possible, like cold water rising past your feet. The kind you notice before you can manage to step away. He turned on his heel and headed for the elevator. He needed air, needed distance, needed a place with no charts, no white hallways, no eyes belonging to a woman who could carry her own weight without ever asking anyone for help. That afternoon, when Daniel came back to room 407, Claire wasn't there anymore. Eleanor was asleep. The room was in perfect order, pillow adjusted just so, window cracked exactly enough. A small note on the nightstand, in Claire's handwriting. 6 p.m. Medication, don't forget. "Good afternoon, Eleanor." Daniel picked up the note, read it twice. Firm handwriting, no flourish, direct. He folded the paper and set it back down with a care that wasn't his usual style, and one he wouldn't have known how to explain if anyone had asked. He stood there a long moment, looking at his sleeping mother, at the face that had aged while he was busy building empires, at the hands that had made him breakfast every morning for years, and now rested on the white sheet with a fragility he wasn't ready to face. "When she holds my hand, I calm right down." He closed his eyes, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, Daniel Hartwell wasn't angry at anyone or anything. He was simply ashamed. Which he discovered in that moment was so much worse. What he still didn't know would only become clear the next day when he arrived earlier than usual and overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear, was that Claire had quietly asked the nursing coordinator about the process for requesting a transfer. Not a formal transfer yet, just a quiet professional inquiry, the kind people make when they haven't decided anything yet but already sense they might need a way out. And if she left, if she stepped away from room 407 for any reason, the doctor had been clear. It would be a risk that Eleanor's current condition might not be able to absorb without consequences. Fate in that hospital in the heart of Chicago had set a perfect trap, and Daniel Hartwell was standing dead center in it with no idea yet of the size of what he'd done. The nursing coordinator at Lakeside Memorial was named Renee Sullivan, 51, short hair, thin-framed glasses, and a way of speaking that left no doubt about who was in charge of that floor. She'd built her reputation over 23 years of hospital management by being exactly the kind of professional who didn't bend for anyone not the chief physician, not a patient's family member, not a man in an expensive suit who showed up at her office door with no appointment. Daniel showed up with no appointment. It was a Tuesday morning. Claire hadn't clocked in yet. The fourth-floor hallway moved at its usual pace, busy, functional, that particular background hum that mixes quick footsteps with low voices and the steady sound of machines that never stop. Renee looked up from her screen when he walked in. She didn't stand. "Mr. Hartwell," she said in the tone of someone who'd already been warned about him by the front desk. "What can I do for you?" Daniel shut the door behind him, sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited. An automatic gesture from a man rarely told he needs permission to take up space. "I want to make sure the nurse assigned to my mother's case stays on it," he said directly. "I understand there's an open transfer inquiry. I want closed." Renee took off her glasses, set them on the desk, and looked at him with the calm of someone who'd seen this movie before. "You're asking me to override a decision that belongs to the nurse. I'm asking that the case be handled with the priority it deserves," Daniel answered. His voice stayed controlled, but something underneath it was leaking at the edges. "My mother is in a delicate spot right now. Dr. Ellis was clear about how important continuity of care is. If there's something that can be done to guarantee that continuity, I want it done." "I understand your concern," Renee said, "and Dr. Ellis is right about continuity mattering, but what you're describing isn't an administrative decision. It's a personal one, made by a professional. And that decision isn't mine to interfere with. It isn't yours either." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I'm the one financially responsible for my mother's stay here. I'm paying for this private wing." "That," Renee cut in with a firmness so polite it was nearly impossible to argue with, "guarantees you the best care this hospital has to offer. It does not guarantee you the right to decide who works here and where. My staff is not a personal service you've contracted as a family member. They are professionals with autonomy, with rights, and with decisions I will respect, even when it's inconvenient for me." The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Daniel buttoned his jacket in one mechanical motion, looked at Renee with the expression of a man not used to leaving a room without what he came for. "If there's any update on my mother's condition," he said, "I want to be notified immediately." "As always," Renee said, and had already put her glasses back on. He left. Renee sat looking at the closed door for a moment, not with anger, but with the expression of someone who'd just had an old suspicion about a certain kind of person confirmed all over again. Claire arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later. She came in through the side entrance, like always changed in the third-floor locker room, and took the stairs up, an old habit left over from a previous hospital, where the elevator was always broken, and she'd simply folded the stairs into her arrival routine. Frank was at the lobby desk when she passed. He called her name. "Claire!" She stopped, walked back 2 steps. The doorman's expression was different from usual. Not the man who asked about her daughter and commented on the weather. This was the look of someone holding on to something, weighing whether to hand it over. "That man from the car," he said, lowering his voice. "He was here early this morning, went up to the 4th floor, stayed maybe 20 minutes before he came back down." Claire stayed quiet. "I don't know what he went up there for," Frank went on, "but I figured you should know, because around here we look out for each other." It was a simple sentence, the kind that doesn't need explanation to land deep. "Thank you, Frank," she said. He nodded and went back to his post. Claire stood in the lobby a moment, that new piece of information settling in a way she couldn't quite organize yet. He'd come before she'd even arrived. Gone up to the 4th floor not to see his mother because Eleanor had said the day before that he never showed up before 10. It was 8:40. She climbed the stairs faster than usual. Renee was waiting at the door of her office. That wasn't like her. Renee didn't wait for anyone. Renee stayed at her desk and let people come to her. "Come in," was all she said. Claire stepped in, sat down, looked at the coordinator with the calm attention of someone who'd already learned that bad news doesn't get smaller, no matter how much you brace for it. "The family member from 407 was here," Renee said, no preamble. "Asked me to guarantee your placement on the case using a financial argument." Claire closed her eyes for half a second. "I said no," Renee continued. made it clear that decision is yours and that nobody interferes with it. But I thought you should know because you have a right to know what's happening around your own name. Thank you, Claire said. Her voice came out whole, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. The transfer inquiry you opened, Renee laced her fingers together on the desk. I need an answer by tomorrow. Not because I'm pressuring you, but because I've got another nurse waiting on placement, and I can't leave it open much longer. Claire nodded. I understand. You know what's clinically at stake, Renee said. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. Dr. Ellis was clear. I'm not telling you this to trap you. I'm telling you because you're the kind of professional who makes decisions with full information, not half of it. Claire looked down at her own hands for a second. The same hands Eleanor had described. The same hands Dr. Ellis had reduced to clinical terms. The same hands Daniel Hartwell had tried, without even realizing it, to use as leverage in a room that was never his to negotiate in. By tomorrow, she said, and left. The fourth floor was quieter than usual when Claire passed room 407. Eleanor was awake, but something was different. She was sitting with her eyes on the window, hands still on top of the sheet, without the usual smile she gave every visitor. Morning, Claire said with her usual lightness. Eleanor turned her head. The smile came but a second slower than normal. Morning, sweetheart. Claire started her routine check blood pressure temperature notes on the chart, but her eyes kept reading Eleanor's face. Did you sleep all right? More or less. A pause. Daniel was here early, before you got in. Claire didn't stop what she was doing. I know, she said neutrally. He sat there watching me sleep for the longest time. Eleanor's voice stayed low, thoughtful. When I opened my eyes, he looked away, made like he was just checking his phone. She gave a smile that was sad and fond at once. He's done that since he was a kid. When he's scared, he pretends he's busy. Claire finished her notes. Eleanor, she said carefully, you need a quiet day today. No long visits, no conversations that wear you out. Dr. Ellis was specific about it. Eleanor nodded, but caught Claire's wrist before she could step away. Not her hand, her wrist. The way you hold not a person, but time itself. Are you going to stay? The 4 words dropped into the room with a weight Claire hadn't been prepared for. She looked at that woman at the eyes that knew more than they said, at a question that wasn't about a work schedule at all. It was about presence, about continuity, about the difference between being there and just showing up. And for the first time since opening that transfer inquiry, Claire felt the decision pulling from a different direction. Not her own side. Eleanor's side. I'm here today, she answered true, without promising more than she could keep. Eleanor let go of her wrist, nodded with that quiet dignity of someone who's learned to accept what's given without demanding what isn't guaranteed. Claire left the room, stopped in the hallway back to the closed door, eyes fixed on the wall ahead. 48 hours to decide. Staying meant continuing on the same floor as the man who had, in 2 minutes of coldness, torn apart something she'd built over years of dignity. Leaving meant abandoning a 67-year-old woman who had done nothing but hold her hand like someone clinging to her own life, leaving her without the one face that calmed her when the nights got too heavy. There was no clean way out. And it was exactly then, while she stood alone in the hallway, weighing the impossible, that the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and Daniel Hartwell stepped out. They saw each other at the same instant. This thing neither one looked away right away. And this time there was something on his face that wasn't coldness, wasn't shock, wasn't the managed arrogance of the man from the car. It was guilt. Real guilt, the kind you can't pretend away. But guilt, Claire knew better than anyone, is not the same thing as change. She'd learned that in 8 years of ICU work and long nights holding the hands of frightened people, that the distance between feeling something and doing something is exactly the space where people lose themselves. She turned sideways, took the stairs, and left him standing in the hallway with the weight of everything he still had left to prove. Claire didn't sleep. It wasn't the kind of insomnia that comes out of nowhere, without a face, without a reason. Themselves, it was the insomnia of someone carrying a decision on her chest like a physical object, with shape, with edges, with weight that shifted every time she tried to find a comfortable position. She lay in her Bridgeport apartment staring at the ceiling with the uncomfortable clarity of someone who already knows deep down what she's going to do but isn't ready yet to accept the cost of it. Stay. Not for him, never for him. For herself. For Eleanor. For those hands that gripped her wrist like they were holding on to time. For those eyes that knew more than they said and chose anyway to trust. Claire had come into this profession for one simple reason that time hadn't erased. She believed that caring for someone was one of the only truly selfless acts a human being could practice. There's no audience in an ICU at 3 in the morning. No recognition in a hallway at that hour. Just the real, physical, constant presence of someone who chooses to stay when everything gets too heavy. Walking away from Eleanor to protect her own pride wasn't dignity, it was the opposite of dignity. She thought about the mother she'd lost too young. Thought about the grandmother who'd raised her with work-worn hands and an open heart, who'd once told her in a small kitchen that smelled like coffee brewed in an old percolator that we don't get to choose the pain we're handed, only what we do with it. That carrying pain with dignity isn't weakness, it's the quietest, most real kind of strength there is. Claire had kept that sentence somewhere she didn't show anybody. And that night in the small apartment she'd earned through years of double shifts and sacrificed weekends, that sentence came back to her not as comfort, but as a compass. She knew what to do. She'd always known. She just needed time to accept the cost. She got to the hospital 40 minutes before her shift started. Found Renee before she'd even changed into her scrubs. "I'm staying," she said at the office door. Renee looked at her for a second, nodded. "I'll note it down." Nothing more needed saying. Daniel arrived at 10:15. Claire was at the nurse's station in the hallway when he stepped off the elevator, scrubs chart in hand, the posture of someone doing exactly what needed doing and needing no one's approval for it. He stopped a few feet away. "Can I talk to you? I'm on shift." "It's quick." She looked up at him, direct, no deflection this time. "If it's about your mother, talk to Dr. Ellis. If it's about scheduling, talk to the coordinator. If it's about anything else, this isn't the time or the place." He stood there, jaw tight, the words he'd clearly prepared, visibly dissolving before they reached the surface. "Okay," he said, and went into his mother's room. Claire went back to the chart. The words were there, but she wasn't reading them. She was thinking about how one person could take up so much space in a hallway just by existing. About how injustice deeply and quietly felt to have the man who'd shattered something in her in 2 minutes of coldness now walking the same hallway where she worked like the world just kept spinning at the same speed it always had. Didn't it, though? Of course it did. It just wasn't easy to accept before breakfast. What happened 2 hours later was on nobody's schedule. The cardiac monitor in room 407 sounded its alarm at 12:43. Claire was first through the door. She'd been less than 10 feet away in the hallway. Behind her, within seconds, came the nursing assistant Megan and Dr. Ellis, who, by luck, was still on the floor finishing late rounds. Eleanor was conscious, but her face had lost its color, and there was a labored quality to her breathing that hadn't been there that morning. Visible effort, like the air had suddenly gotten heavier than it should have been. "Eleanor." Claire used the voice she reserved for moments like this, steady close, without alarm. "I'm right here. Look at me." Eleanor looked. Her eyes were frightened. Not the kind of fear that paralyzes, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from realizing your own body is doing something without asking permission. "I feel strange," Eleanor said, her voice fainter than usual. "I know. I'm here. Breathe slow for me." Dr. Ellis took over the protocol. Claire stayed beside Eleanor, holding her hand, doing the one thing the doctor and every machine in that room couldn't do alone, making that woman feel like she wasn't going through this without company. There's a rhythm to it that only people who've done it many times understand. It's never automatic, never, because every person is different. Every hand needs to be held a different way. Every breath carries its own specific fear. But there's an emotional muscle that develops over time, one that lets you stay present without losing yourself, that lets you hold on without gripping too hard, that lets you say, "I'm here," in a way the other person's body believes before their mind even catches up. Claire had that muscle. She'd built it one hallway at a time. Outside, Daniel had been asked to wait in the hallway by Megan's standard protocol, family out during an emergency response. He stood there, leaning against the wall across from the door phone in hand, screen, dark eyes locked on the closed door, with an expression that didn't quite have a name in any language. It was the face of a son who had just truly understood that his mother was mortal, not as an idea, but as a fact. And there was a particular cruelty to that white, silent hallway, the fact that he was standing outside, unable to do anything, while on the other side of the door was a woman he'd once treated as invisible, doing exactly the thing he didn't know how to do. Staying. 22 minutes later, Dr. Ellis stepped out. Daniel closed the distance in 2 steps. Her condition shifted, the doctor said with the careful bluntness of someone choosing each word on purpose. It's not a critical emergency right now, but it's a warning sign we need to take seriously. We're adjusting medication and increasing monitoring over the next several hours. She needs absolute rest. No emotional strain, no long visits. I need to go in, Daniel said. 5 minutes. No more than that, and nothing that could upset her. Daniel nodded, waited for the doctor to move off, put his hand on the door handle, and stopped. The door was cracked open. Not enough to see much, enough to hear. Claire's voice, low and steady, drifted through the gap. "You were so brave just now. You know that?" And Eleanor's voice, fainter but whole. "I was scared, sweetheart." "I know, I saw, and you stayed. That's courage." A pause. "Do you want me to stay until Daniel comes in?" "Stay," Eleanor said. Simple. No hesitation. "Then I'll stay." Daniel let go of the handle, stood frozen in the hallway with those words echoing in a way he couldn't control. Not Claire's words, his mother's. "I was scared, sweetheart." Eleanor had called Claire sweetheart with the same warmth, the same ease, the same surrender she used to call him that when he was 8 years old, waking up from nightmares he couldn't describe. And there was something in that, not jealousy, not exactly, that hit Daniel like a mirror he hadn't asked for and wasn't ready to face. How many nights had his mother spent in that hospital before he showed up? How many early mornings had been carried not by her son, but by a woman in green scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck, who stayed because she chose to stay, not out of obligation, not out of protocol, but because staying was simply who she was. How many times had Eleanor looked at that door, hoping to see him, and found Claire there instead? He pushed the door open gently. Claire looked up. Their eyes met. She didn't leave right away. She finished adjusting Eleanor's pillow with one precise, gentle movement, said something quiet to her that he couldn't hear, and then stood to go. She passed him on her way out, close enough that the smell of the hospital and the coffee she'd had too early mixed together in the small room's air. And it was in that moment, with her less than a foot away, that Daniel said quietly, almost without meaning to, "Thank you." Claire stopped, didn't turn around, stood with her back to him for 2 seconds that weighed more than any speech he could have prepared. And then she left without answering, not out of coldness, not out of cruelty, but because in that moment still wasn't enough. Thank you was the easiest currency to spend. It cost nothing, proved nothing. Changed nothing about what had happened on that sidewalk off Michigan Avenue, with the traffic honking and the doorman watching, and her walking away with her backpack on her shoulder, dignity intact on the outside and cracked clean through on the inside. She went to the nurse's station, sat down, opened Eleanor's chart, and began writing up the incident in firm, even handwriting. Megan came up behind her with a cup of coffee and set it on the desk without a word. The kind of gesture a colleague makes that needs no explanation. Claire looked at the cup, looked at Megan. "Thanks." "You stayed," Megan said quietly. "Everybody on this floor knows you stayed, and everybody knows why." Claire didn't answer. But for one brief instant, something in her face let the real weight show through. It wasn't regret over the decision to stay. It was the exhaustion of having to be strong in every hallway, in front of every set of eyes, without ever having a safe place to simply stop. Without ever getting to say, "Today I can't." Without ever getting to be the person who needs care, instead of always being the one who gives it. Megan stood beside her a moment, didn't say anything else, didn't need to. Sometimes the biggest act of care is simply not walking away. That afternoon, near the end of Claire's shift, Renee appeared in the hallway with an expression Claire recognized immediately. Bad news, administrative flavored. The bureaucratic kind. No emotion attached, but very real consequences. "I need to give you a heads up," Renee said low, away from other ears. "With the patient in 407's condition worsening, protocol requires the case to be reclassified. That means daily oversight from Dr. Ellis and possibly a second specialist. Your workload on this case is going to increase significantly over the next few weeks." Claire stayed quiet. "On top of that," Renee went on, "the board's been made aware of the transfer inquiry you opened. Not by me. I don't know who, but it's on record, and if there's any future complication with the patient, that history could be brought up for review." The meaning of that settled in slowly, with surgical precision. If Eleanor got worse, if anything went sideways, the fact that Claire had opened a transfer inquiry could be used to question her commitment to the case. It wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be right. But it would be possible. And in the real world, possible was enough to damage a career built over 8 years of dedication. Claire felt the ground shift slightly beneath her. Not literally the ground that shifts inside a person when something solid suddenly shows a crack that wasn't there that morning. Someone had leaked that information to the board, and Claire knew with a certainty that didn't need proof exactly who had been in that hospital early enough to access that kind of administrative detail. Who had gone up to the 4th floor before she'd even arrived? Who had tried to use influence to fix what money couldn't buy, and once refused had left tracks that now threatened an entire career? It wasn't calculated malice. She knew that. It was the kind of damage powerful people cause without noticing because they're so used to moving pieces around that they forget the pieces have names, have histories, have 8 years of night shifts, and a grandmother who taught them that dignity isn't for sale. But the damage was done, and she'd have to carry the consequences of a decision that wasn't even hers to begin with. "I understand," Claire said to Renee. Her voice came out whole at a cost. "If you need anything, my door's open." Claire nodded, waited for Renee to walk away, stood alone in the hallway a moment, the hospital's constant noise around her, this new weight stacked on top of everything she was already carrying. She looked at the closed door of room 407, at the distance between where she stood and where she needed to go, and understood that staying had been the right call, but that the price of doing the right thing in this world rarely comes with a discount. The fight wasn't over. It had just changed shape, and she was still standing. For now. The letter was on the desk in the coordinator's office when Claire arrived the next morning. Not an ordinary envelope, the kind that comes on letterhead with an institutional logo in the corner and language that reads neutral but isn't, language built by people who've learned how to cause damage using the vocabulary of protocol. Renee sat on the other side of the desk. No coffee, no small talk, just the paper and the heavy silence of someone who has to hand over something she didn't want to hand over. "The board opened an internal review," Renee said, "about the situation in 407. Claire looked at the paper without picking it up. "Based on what?" "Based on the transfer inquiry on file, combined with a report claiming there's been tension between you and the family member responsible for the patient." Renee paused. "I'm not saying I agree with it. I'm telling you what's written." "Tension." Claire repeated the word. It landed with a specific weight, not anger, recognition. Somebody had taken what actually happened in the hallway, the two of them crossing paths, her stepping aside him trying to speak, and turned it into evidence of professional conflict. Taken reality and twisted it just enough degrees to change what it looked like without needing to lie outright. It was an elegant kind of blow, the kind that only works when the person throwing it has more power than the person catching it. "The review doesn't mean punishment," Renee continued. But it means that while it's open, you can't be reassigned, can't request a transfer, and any complication with the patient will be reviewed inside that context. Claire processed every word with the calm of someone who'd learned that reacting too fast in a moment like this is exactly what the other side is counting on. Can I see the report? Not yet. The process gives 48 hours before documentation gets released to the person under review. Understood. She picked up the paper, read it, folded it, set it back down. Do I keep working normally? Yes, until further notice. Claire stood-buttoned her white coat with the same precise movements as always, looked at Renee with that direct gaze that never asked for validation and never offered a breakdown either. Thanks for telling me in person. And she left. The fourth-floor hallway moved at its regular pace, carts, footsteps, low voices, the hospital running with the productive indifference of a machine that doesn't stop for any one person's pain. Claire went straight to the nurse's station, picked up Eleanor's chart, checked the overnight notes, with the attention of someone hunting for any variation, any sign that might need adjusting. Megan came up beside her, already knowing. You heard? Claire asked without looking up. Hospital's small, Megan said quietly. I'm sorry. Don't be, Claire answered, and she meant it. Pity right then was exactly the kind of thing that softened what needed to stay firm. She went into room 407. Eleanor was sitting up, propped against the pillows, a book open in her lap that clearly wasn't being read. Her eyes were on the window. The light coming through was gray, the kind of Chicago morning where the clouds beat the sun to the punch and just stay. Morning, Eleanor. She turned. The smile came, but her eyes weren't rested. There was something in them Claire recognized, a rough night. The kind that doesn't come from physical pain, but from thoughts that won't stop turning. Morning, sweetheart. A pause. You doing all right? Claire started her routine check. I'm fine. How was the night? Long. Eleanor paused, then in that direct, gentle way that was her signature. Daniel stayed late. We talked. Claire didn't change the rhythm of her notes. That's good he stayed. He told me something. Eleanor spoke slowly, choosing her footing before each step. That he treated you badly outside the hospital before you started taking care of me? That he regrets it and doesn't know how to fix it. The silence that settled into the room was different from all the others. It had texture, weight sideways like a wall appearing where you didn't expect one. Claire finished her notes, closed the chart. Eleanor, she said gently. You don't need to carry that. It's not your responsibility. I know it's not, but he's my son, and I know him better than he knows himself. She looked at Claire with those eyes that saw past what people showed. I'm not asking you to forgive him. That's not mine to ask. I'm just telling you that his heart is broken in a way he doesn't have the words for yet. Claire looked at that woman a moment. There was a soft trap in that conversation, not intentional, not manipulative, but real. The trap of being loved by someone who also loves the other side. The impossible position of becoming the bridge between two people in conflict without anyone explicitly asking her to. You need to rest, Claire said with gentle firmness. Dr. Ellis is coming by later, and I don't want him finding you all worked up. Eleanor nodded, but caught Claire's hand for a second before she stepped away. Whatever's going on outside this room, she said quietly, I want you to know you're the best thing that's happened to me in here. And I'm not saying that for my son. I'm saying it because it's true. Claire squeezed her hand once firmly and left before anything else could show on her face. He was in the hallway, not near the door, but farther down, leaning against the wall by the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked out over the city below. Chicago, mid-morning, dense and loud, and completely oblivious to anything happening on the fourth floor of Lakeside Memorial. Daniel was in a simpler suit than the ones before, no tie, his hair a little less controlled than at any previous encounter. And there was something in his posture, not slumped shoulders, not an averted gaze, but a kind of openness in the way he occupied the space that was different from anything she'd seen in him so far. Claire headed for the stairs. Claire, not Ms. Bennett, her name spoken in a voice that had lost the layer of control it carried in every previous encounter. She stopped, didn't turn right away, breathed, then turned. "I heard about the review," he said, eyes direct, no deflection. "I caused that. It wasn't intentional, but it was me. I went to the coordinator. I went to administration. I got into things I had no business getting into, and without meaning to, I put your name into a process that shouldn't exist." Claire stayed quiet. "I want to fix it," he went on. "Can I go to the board? Can I retract whatever came out under my name?" "Stop." The word came out low, but it stopped him completely. "You went to the coordinator and used money to try to keep me on the case? When that didn't work, you went to administration, and whatever you said there triggered a review of my professional conduct, of 8 years of my career." A pause. "And now you want to go back there and fix it using the same influence that caused the problem in the first place." He didn't answer, because there was no answer that wouldn't confirm exactly what she'd just said. "You can't fix this by going back there," Claire continued, "because the problem isn't the review. The review is just a symptom. The problem is that you believe everything has a solution if you apply enough pressure in the right place. And sometimes it does. But not when the thing you broke is someone else's reputation. There's no shortcut for that." Daniel closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, something had changed. It wasn't the guilt from 2 days ago in the hallway. That guilt had still been comfortable, still fit inside his chest without asking much of him. This was something else. Harder to name. It was shame finally finding the right address. "What can I do?" he said. And for the first time since the car, the question had no strategy hidden inside it. It was genuine. It was the question of someone finally on the ground who'd stopped pretending otherwise. Claire looked at him a long moment. "Nothing," she answered. "Right now, absolutely nothing." And she went for the stairs. The review moved faster than Renee had expected. Late that afternoon, a board member named Dr. August Myers, 58, gray hair, the kind of man who built his authority on being efficient rather than being human, asked to meet with Claire in a small second-floor conference room used for administrative meetings. The kind of room with a very particular silence, the kind where uncomfortable decisions get delivered. He got straight to it. Given the documented history of tension between the staff member and the responsible family member, and considering the patient's delicate clinical state, the board believes a temporary reassignment of care team may be appropriate to preserve the patient's therapeutic environment. Claire listened to every word carefully. "Temporary reassignment," she repeated. "Temporary," he confirmed. "While the review is ongoing." Translated out of protocol speak, it meant this. They were considering pulling her off Eleanor's case, not as a declared punishment, but as a precaution, which in practice was the same thing with a different name. Pulling her now with Eleanor at her most fragile point since admission could destabilize the patient in a way Dr. Ellis had already described as clinically risky, and that possibility Claire understood hadn't landed on the table by accident. Somebody had calculated that the clinical risk of removing her would function as leverage, that she'd cave before any formal decision was even made, that the love she'd developed for that patient would be the most efficient lever for controlling her. She looked at Dr. Myers for a moment too long to be comfortable. "When will the board have a final decision?" 48 hours. Claire stood, buttoned her coat. "I'll be available for whatever process you need to run," she said, "on one condition, that Dr. Ellis is consulted before any decision about reassignment is implemented." A patient's clinical state can't be assessed by administration. Dr. Myers nodded with the expression of someone who hadn't expected that level of composure. Claire took the stairs to the lobby, walked past Frank's desk without stopping, pushed through the side door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Chicago was doing what Chicago always did, loud, indifferent, full of people walking past without a glance sideways. Claire stood there a moment, still in her coat, the weight of 48 hours opening up in front of her, like a gap she'd have to cross without knowing if there was solid ground on the other side. 8 years of a career. An open review. A patient who'd called her sweetheart. A man who'd shattered something in her with 2 minutes of carelessness, and now needed 48 hours to understand that some kinds of damage don't come with a shortcut. And her standing on a Chicago sidewalk, city noise all around her, no grandmother to call, no safe place to set down her exhaustion, nobody arriving to say, "I'm here, breathe slow." For the first time in this entire story, Claire Bennett felt the ground, really felt it. Not metaphorically, for real. And the question that hung in the air while Chicago kept spinning around her with its usual indifference was simple and impossible at the same time. How long can one person keep being strong for everybody else and nobody for themselves? Claire's decision didn't come from anger. It came from the same place all her important decisions came from, that quiet internal space she'd learned to listen to before the outside noise got too loud to hear anything over. She spent the 48 hours Dr. Myers had set working normally, full shifts, charts in order. Eleanor getting the same care as always, no more, no less, because more would have been a performance and less would have been abandonment, and Claire did neither. But within those 48 hours, while the hospital ran on around her with its usual productive indifference, Claire made a decision nobody else knew about yet. She wasn't going to wait for the board to decide for her. On the morning of the second day, she got in before anyone else, changed in the empty locker room, took the stairs up, went straight to Renee's office. The coordinator arrived 10 minutes later and found Claire sitting there with an envelope in her hand and an expression that wasn't defeat and wasn't defiance either. It was clarity. "I'm submitting my voluntary withdrawal from the case in 407, Claire said. "Not as a response to the review, as my own choice, made before any institutional decision comes down." Renee stood frozen in the doorway for a second. "Claire, I need this on record," Claire continued with gentle firmness, "that I left because I chose to leave, not because I was pulled. That distinction matters for my professional record, and I'm not giving it up." Renee came in, shut the door, sat down slowly. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Claire answered, also. "I'm also submitting a second document requesting an immediate transfer to the general medical floor on 2. If there's no opening, I'm requesting full separation from Lakeside Memorial." The silence that settled was the kind Renee clearly hadn't seen coming for that morning. "You're walking away from a case Dr. Ellis himself said is clinically dependent on you being there?" Renee said, not as an argument, but as a fact that needed to be said out loud. "I know," Claire answered, "and I wrote a full continuity of care letter with every instruction the next nurse needs to take over, without any harm to the patient. It's in the envelope." Renee looked at the envelope, looked at Claire. "This is going to cost you," she said quietly. "It already has," Claire replied. "The difference is now the cost is my choice." Renee took the envelope, opened it, read it in silence, and when she finished, there was something on her face that wasn't administrative approval. It was respect, the kind that doesn't need protocol to exist. "I'll process this today," she said. Claire buttoned her coat for the last time in that office. "Thank you for being fair with me from the start." And she left. She went to room 407 one last time. Eleanor was awake, book in her lap as usual, eyes more rested than they'd been in days. The medication adjustment had worked, breathing steadier, color slowly returning to her face, in that quiet way only someone paying close attention would notice. Claire came in with her usual smile, checked vitals, wrote in the chart with her usual firm hand, and then stood by the bed a moment longer than usual, not in movement, but in weight. Eleanor noticed, looked up from her book. "What is it?" "I came to say goodbye," Claire said. Simple, direct, because Eleanor deserved the truth without wrapping paper. Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Her eyes didn't fill immediately. She processed, first, the way someone does when they've learned how to take hard news without letting it knock everything over at once. "You're leaving the hospital?" "I'm leaving your case," Claire answered. "A colleague of mine, Nurse Sylvia, is taking over your care starting today. She's excellent. You'll like her." "That's not why you're leaving, is it?" Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. Claire looked at that woman, the white hair, the marked hands, the eyes that saw past what people showed. "No," she answered honestly. "It's not just that." Eleanor took that in slowly with the quiet dignity of someone accepting without agreeing because she understood some situations are bigger than the room they happen in. "You were the best thing about this hospital," she said. Her voice stayed steady, but there was the smallest tremor at the edges, the kind that shows up when someone's holding on to something they'd rather not have to hold. "I want you to know that, no matter what." Claire took her hand once with that firmness that was her signature, not a sentimental goodbye squeeze, but real presence, the kind that says, "You mattered to me for real." "Take care of yourself," Claire said, "and make your son get here earlier." Eleanor let out a small, involuntary laugh, the kind that escapes when emotion runs into something true along the way. Claire left. The envelope for Daniel was on the nightstand when Eleanor glanced over. Claire had left it before coming into the room, asked Megan to set it there after she was gone. She hadn't wanted to be present when he found it. Not out of fear of the encounter, but because some things need to be read in silence, without the writer standing there, in order to really land. Daniel arrived at 9:40, earlier than his old pattern, earlier than any day since his mother had been admitted. Eleanor was quiet when he walked in. He noticed immediately. He knew that particular silence. He'd grown up inside it. "What's wrong? I have a letter for you," she said, nodding toward the nightstand. He picked up the envelope, saw his name written in that firm, unadorned handwriting he'd already learned to recognize. He opened it. "I'm not writing this to explain myself. I'm writing it because I believe some things need to be said clearly before silence gets to distort them. You treated me like I didn't exist at a moment when I was carrying the weight of 2 back-to-back shifts and the responsibility of lives that weren't my own. That happened. It won't stop having happened. But I'm not leaving because of that car. I'm leaving because everything that came after the maneuvering the reports, the review showed me that you still believe power can fix what power broke, and I can't work in a place where my name is being used as a piece in a game I never agreed to play. Your mother is an extraordinary woman. Taking care of her was a privilege I'll carry with me. She's going to be fine not because I stayed, but because she's strong in a way most people don't recognize, because they're too busy looking in the wrong place. I'm not angry at you. I'm tired of a very specific kind of invisibility, the kind that doesn't come from cruelty, but from the carelessness of someone who's never had to be seen in order to exist. You have time to change that, but not with me as your witness. It has to happen because you decided it should, not because someone's watching." Daniel read it twice. On the second pass, he stood holding the paper for a length of time Eleanor didn't measure because she'd learned in 67 years that some moments don't fit on a clock. "She's gone," he said. It wasn't a question. "She's gone," Eleanor answered. The silence that followed was different from every other silence that room had held. It had a specific texture, the texture of something that can no longer be undone, that had crossed past the point where regret still changes anything and arrived at the point where only action counts. Daniel folded the letter carefully, tucked it into his jacket, not the nightstand, not his bag, the inside pocket closest to his chest. And then he did something Eleanor hadn't seen since he was maybe 12 years old. He sat on the edge of her bed, not the visitor's chair, the edge of the bed like a son, like someone who'd finally stopped pretending he was just passing through. "Mom," he said. His voice came out different without the layer of control she'd heard in every conversation for years. "When Dad left, I decided I was never going to need anybody, that I'd build everything myself and that would protect me." Eleanor stayed quiet, listening. "I built it," he went on. "Everything I set out to build. But I did it thinking building was the same thing as living. It isn't." A long pause. "I treated that woman like an obstacle, and she was carrying the whole world on her back without asking anybody to applaud her for it." "That's who she is," Eleanor said softly. "I know that now," Daniel answered. "I know." His mother put her hand over his. Didn't say anything because there was nothing left to say. That gesture wouldn't say better. They sat like that for a while, mother and son in a hospital room in Chicago, the noisy city outside, and that particular silence of someone who's finally stopped running from himself. That afternoon, Daniel went to the second floor of Lakeside Memorial. Not looking for Claire, he knew she wasn't on the private wing anymore, and he didn't go looking. He went to Dr. Myers's office, walked in with no appointment, the same way he had with Renee weeks earlier. But this time his posture was different. No strategy in his body, no angle of a man arriving to negotiate. "I want to formally retract any report or statement that came from me and contributed to the review opened against Nurse Claire Bennett," he said, standing, not sitting. "And I want it on record that her leaving the case was her decision alone, made before any institutional communication went out, and that there is no conduct issue on her part to investigate." Dr. Myers looked at him a moment. "You understand this closes the review without a formal finding?" "I understand," Daniel said. "And I also understand I should have understood that before I caused the problem. I'm fixing what can be fixed." The director nodded, made a few notes, said the process would be closed within 24 hours. Daniel left the office without knowing if Claire would ever hear about it, without knowing if it would change anything between them. He'd done it because it was right, not because anyone was watching. And it was the first time in a long time he'd acted that way. Claire found out the next day, through an institutional email, the review had been closed, with no formal finding, no name attached to the request, no further explanation. She sat looking at the screen for a long moment, then closed her laptop and went to work because life went on, because the second floor had patients who needed her, because closing an unjust review didn't erase what had already been done. It showed at most that someone had finally understood the difference between power and responsibility. It was something. It wasn't everything. And Claire Bennett, 34 years old, 8 years of ICU work, dignity intact, knew better than anyone that some stories need more than one right gesture to find the place they're supposed to land. Time would tell whether this was a beginning or an ending. For now, it was just one step from each side. Sylvia was a good nurse. Claire knew that because Megan had mentioned it in the second-floor hallway, one of those quick, between-shift conversations that carry more information than they seem to. Sylvia was attentive, punctual, technically sharp. Eleanor was in good hands. That was what mattered. Claire repeated that to herself in the moments when the second-floor hallway went too quiet, and her mind slid without permission back up to the fourth floor. The work on the second floor was different, faster pace, more varied cases, less room for the kind of extended presence she'd built with Eleanor. It was good in its own way. It demanded enough adjustment to keep her occupied, which kept her from sitting still inside her own head. But there were moments. There were always moments. Daniel hadn't reached out, hadn't shown up on the second floor, hadn't sent a message. She didn't even know if he had her number. And he'd clearly made no effort to find out. The review's closure had come through that dry, bureaucratic email, no name, no personal note. She understood the choice. He'd done the right thing without using it as currency, without showing up right after expecting something in return. He'd acted, stepped back, and left her space untouched. That was different. It was the first genuinely different thing he'd done since the car. Claire didn't turn it into hope. She turned it into data. A new piece of information about a man she was still learning to read, not with her heart, but with the part of her that 8 years in the ICU had taught to trust actions over words, because people show you who they are by what they do when nobody's watching. Eleanor was discharged on a Tuesday morning. Claire didn't know the date. She found out through the hospital's internal system when she pulled up the patient board at the start of her shift and saw room 407 listed as available. Previous patient Daniel Hartwell, status discharged. She stood looking at that line on the screen for a moment, then took a breath and went to work. The call came 3 days later. Unknown number. She didn't usually pick up unknown numbers on shift, but something, an instinct with no rational explanation, made her hit the green button. "Claire." The voice was Eleanor's. She recognized it before the name even registered, recognized it by the texture, the cadence, that specific way of treating each syllable, like something that might break if handled carelessly. "Eleanor." There was something in her own voice that wasn't fully under control either. "I got your number from the hospital," Eleanor said in that direct, gentle tone that was her signature. "Hope you don't mind." "I don't mind." "I got discharged. I'm home now." A pause. "Wanted you to know." Claire closed her eyes for a second. "That's wonderful," she said, and it was the truest sentence she'd spoken in days. "You were missed," Eleanor said. Simple, no drama. "I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I'm saying it because you deserve to know you made a real difference. The kind that doesn't show up on any chart." Claire didn't answer right away. There was a pressure behind her eyes she recognized well. The pressure of emotion that hasn't found an exit in too long, looking for a crack to slip through. "Thank you for calling," she finally managed. "There's one more thing," Eleanor said, and there was something in her tone, a careful lightness, the kind that wraps a delicate subject in cotton before handing it over. "Daniel wants to see you. He didn't ask me to say that. He doesn't know I'm calling. But I've been a mother for 38 years, and I've learned that sometimes people need a push nobody asked for." Claire stayed quiet. "He's changed," Eleanor went on. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to give yourself the chance to see for yourself. Whatever you decide after that is entirely yours." It always was. The silence that followed was different from every other silence in this story. There was no tension in it, no weight of an impossible decision, just the open space of something that didn't have a shape yet, and might or might not ever take one. "I'll think about it," Claire said. "That's all I asked," Eleanor answered, and there was a smile in her voice, clear like light through a window early in the morning. She thought about it for 2 days. Not anxiously. She didn't lie awake, didn't replay conversations, didn't build scenarios. She thought about it the way she thought through decisions that mattered. Let the question exist inside her without forcing an answer, and waited for the answer to arrive from the right place. It arrived on an ordinary morning as she came down the hospital stairwell after her shift, and the Chicago sun poured through the third-floor window the particular way the city does on certain days. Golden, warm, entirely indifferent to the fact that some people are in the middle of something important. She stopped on the third step, and she knew. The coffee shop was called Simple Grounds, 2 blocks from Lakeside Memorial. The kind of small place that exists in the cracks of big cities foretells the smell of wood and fresh brewed coffee. No loud music, no rush. Claire got there first, ordered a coffee, sat facing the door. She'd chosen the place, set the time, arrived early, not out of nerves because she wanted to be settled in the space before he got there. A small, entirely deliberate distinction. Daniel walked in 3 minutes later. No suit, dark pants, a plain shirt, his hair less controlled than at any previous meeting. And there was something in his posture, not slumped shoulders, not an averted gaze, but a kind of openness in the way he took up space that was different from anything she'd seen in him so far. He saw her, paused a second, walked to the table, sat across from her. He didn't open with an apology, didn't open with a prepared speech. He opened with the one thing left once everything else had already been said, or tried, or failed. "Thanks for coming." Claire wrapped both hands around her cup, looked at him with that direct gaze he'd learned to recognize by now, the one that doesn't ask for anything, doesn't offer anything, just evaluates, honestly. "I came because I wanted to," she said, "not because someone talked me into it." "I know," he answered. "Your mother told me she called." "Your mother?" she corrected, with a dry trace of humor that was new between them. He let out a small, involuntary laugh, the kind that slips out when something unexpectedly human crosses your path. Then he turned serious again. "I spent my whole life thinking controlling everything was the same as taking care of everything," he said. "My father walked out when I was 8, no explanation, and I decided right then that I was never going to depend on anyone, because depending on someone felt like the same thing as being weak." A pause. "I built an entire life on that. And it worked right up until the day I was scared of losing my mother and ran into an exhausted woman in my car and treated her exhaustion like it was my inconvenience." Claire listened without interrupting. "I'm not telling you this to justify it," Daniel continued. "There's no justifying it. I'm telling you because you wrote in that letter that I acted like power could fix what power broke. And you were right. And it took me longer than it should have to really understand that." The coffee cooled between Claire's hands. "What did you do at the board office?" she asked after a moment. "Retracted the reports? Closed the review?" It was the least I could do. He said it without hesitation. "It was," she agreed. "And you did it without waiting to make sure I found out." He didn't answer because there wasn't anything to add that wouldn't have cheapened it. Claire looked at her cup, then at him. "I don't know what this is," she said with the same blunt honesty that was her trademark. "I don't know if it's the start of something or just the end of a story that started badly. I'm not going to pretend I know." "I don't know either," Daniel said, and there was a particular relief in admitting that. The relief of two adults who'd finally stopped pretending to have answers they didn't have. "What I do know," Claire went on, "is that I came here, and that's already more than I thought I'd do a few weeks ago." Daniel looked at her a long moment, at the woman who'd stepped out of his car, with her backpack on her shoulder and her dignity intact, who'd stayed at a hospital when everything was pushing her to leave, who'd written a letter that asked for nothing and gave everything, who'd shown up at this small Chicago coffee shop, not because she was talked into it, but because she wanted to. "Can I ask you something?" "You can." "The coffee stain on your scrubs." There was something in his voice that came close to difficulty finishing the sentence. "That night in the car I saw it, and I thought—" He stopped, breathed. "I thought something I'm ashamed of having thought. And I need you to know that I understand now what that stain actually meant." Claire watched him. "What did it mean?" she asked. It wasn't a test, it was genuine. "That you'd been working while I was asleep," he said. "That you'd spent hours on your feet taking care of people who weren't your family for a paycheck that doesn't come close to what it's worth, in a system that rarely bothers to say thank you." A pause. "And that when you finally stopped, you got into the wrong car by mistake because you were too exhausted to notice. And I treated you like you were the problem." The silence that followed was the cleanest one in the whole story. No tension in it, no weight of a pending decision. Just two people sitting at a small table in Chicago, coffee cooling between their hands in the exact space where some stories finally arrive at the point where they should have begun. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and then did something neither of them had planned. She pushed her cup toward the middle of the table, a small, almost invisible gesture, and said, "Order me another one." It wasn't a declared forgiveness. It wasn't an announced romance. It wasn't a resolution tied up with a bow. It was a cup of coffee. It was staying a little longer. It was for someone who'd learned to read exactly what people mean when they don't say anything at all more than enough. Daniel waved down the barista, and for the first time since that night off Michigan Avenue, there was something between them that wasn't guilt, wasn't distance, wasn't the tension of two people still unsure if they're about to get hurt. It was time. Real time. Present, unhurried. The kind that only shows up once two people finally stop running and decide with no guarantees at all to see what's on the other side of the silence. Outside Chicago kept right on being loud, dense, indifferent the way it always was. But at that small table, with the smell of coffee and wood and morning light through the window, something had found its way to where it was supposed to be. Not perfect, not without cost, but real. And real, Claire Bennett had learned in every hallway of every hospital she'd ever worked in, is always more than enough to start with. Weeks later, on the day Eleanor walked down the aisle as her own son's matron of honor, dressed in ivory, wearing the smile that always made a room feel bigger, she paused beside Claire for a second before making her way forward. She didn't say anything. She just squeezed Claire's hand once, the same way she used to back in room 407. The way someone holds on to their own life.